And so that sense of always being on the outside or never fully fitting in, it made me acutely aware of my position in society and acutely aware of where I was not. And I think that sense of being on the outer and that sense of never fully fitting in kind of made me a people watcher. It made me fascinated by humans. So I grew up in the western suburbs of Sydney. My parents moved here from India and they arrived here on the back of the White Australia policy. So when they came to Australia, it was a very different Australia. Whilst my parents were incredibly privileged, they were both doctors, we still struggled with a whole range of things. We struggled with racism. I struggled with what it meant to be Australian and still do in many ways. My parents worked really, really hard to send us to a really good school. They sent us to an incredibly privileged school. And so whilst we were relatively well off, compared to a lot of the people I went to school with, we were not. Always struggled with status anxiety and class anxiety. And I went to an all-boys school, so kind of really struggled with what it meant to be a man. And so I think there was something about growing up in between two cultures, in between Indian and Australian culture, always feeling like I was in between the two, never feeling like I was ever fully a part of either, and always feeling like I had to justify myself as being one or the other. When I was in India, I was always called Australian and had to justify my Indianness. And when in Australia, I was always called Indian and asked to justify my Australianness. And so that sense of always being on the outside or never fully fitting in, it made me acutely aware of my position in society and acutely aware of where I was not. And I think that sense of being on the outer and that sense of never fully fitting in kind of made me a people watcher. It made me fascinated by humans, fascinated by how other people live their lives, always trying to learn the rules because I always felt like I didn't quite get them. I didn't fully understand those rules, that those rules were always just a little bit out of reach, or sometimes that the rules were stacked against me sometimes. I felt, whether that was true or not, I always felt like the rules were designed for somebody else in mind. And it was that concept of having the rules somehow designed for somebody else that made me really, at first, really rebel against those rules, really react against those rules, really resist the conformity. And that was a combination of feeling excluded, but also being like a teenager, right? At a very a very prestigious, disciplined school. So I was always acting out and always testing the boundaries, always challenging the status quo. Always trying to understand what was happening, how people fit in, how people live their lives, and trying to sort of get a sense of what it all meant while still being connected to my lived experience of not quite fitting in and somehow gravitating towards other people who had a similar lived experience. And I think those qualities set me up to be a natural anthropologist because that's what we do. We are always straddling two worlds, if you will. We're always sort of on the outer looking in. Certainly with our ethnographic work, we go to different places and we try to understand the rules. We try to understand what is the big picture while simultaneously trying to understand the lived experience for people. We try to understand where do these rules come from? Who creates the rules? Who benefits from the rules? Who is excluded or rendered invisible by these rules? And so that experience of not really getting the game, understanding the game, really set me up, I think, for a life of anthropology. And it's led me to this moment.